Welcome to the podcast. My name is Chris Hall, and today I am honored to have a returning guest, Dr. Theresa Bullard. Dr. Theresa Bullard is an absolute genius in both physics but also spiritual teachings. She is a lady quite famous through her Gaia series, The Mystery Teachings, and she is also a leader in the mystery school, modern mystery school teachings. And Theresa is a lady that I've had on the podcast before to first of all talk about the place where quantum physics meets mystery and how mystery teachings and science are coming together now. We then reconvened a few months back and talked about archetypes, and today I want to talk about realizing potential and what realizing potential really means. So Dr. Theresa Bullard, welcome back to the podcast. As ever, it is an absolute pleasure. It really is.
Thank you. Yeah, I always have enjoyed our conversations, so I'm looking forward to today's.
Likewise. Okay, so when we have the phrase in popular culture, realizing one's potential, I can almost, hear an old grandma saying, "Oh, he's a lovely lad. He's got so much potential," and all this kind of stuff. And when I think about that kind of stuff in popular culture, realizing one's potential, I feel, has connotations sometimes with expectations, right? So I think about expectations of parents. I think about expectations of peer group, local, your local kind of educational things in terms of what you're brought up with at school and what that meant, what you're meant to go and do, etc. But when we think about realizing potential in the context of expectations, do we need to somewhat deprogram from this idea of people's expectations in terms of realizing potential? Because it's only by letting go of all this stuff in terms of getting lost in terms of what these other people expect of us, and that can kind of hold us back from really going within and connecting with what one's true purpose is. So I guess that's the first question I got. What do you think about this idea of realizing potential having a link to expectations, and how we need to deprogram ourselves from expectations in order to realize ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it especially when we're earlier on in our journey to trying to really maximize our abilities and who we are, we do have to go through that phase of deprogramming and kind of peeling away the layers of the onion of what we think other people expect of us, whether it's what was programmed in by parents or school or culture or education or whatever it may be. We're often comparing ourselves to some standard that was set for us by society or by others outside of us. And then we project, because we don't know ourselves well, so we project that we think other people expect certain things of us, but it's actually our own expectation of ourselves measured up against societal rules, right? Mm-hmm. And so that the only way to really maximize and achieve our potential is to know ourselves. Mm-hmm. So to know ourselves, we have to start stripping away all of those layers of programming and the measuring stick that we kind of measure ourselves up to, and just really get to know, who am I? What am I? What do I like to do? What is my purpose? What is my passion, my joy? And from there, then we'll start tapping into the gifts, because we'll be motivated to direct it towards the things that really bring us joy and that we're passionate about, versus things that we think we have to do, from a sense of obligation or duty or expectation.
Exactly, so right. Sure, it is really interesting. So yes, I think it's especially relevant in earlier days of personal realization. Nevertheless, all of us along this journey, I feel like it's the type of thing, because these things can be deeply entrenched within our psyche, our personality, our makeup of, I don't know, all this stuff called ego in here, right? It's easy for it occasionally to reactivate, even if you've done that work. Would you agree that, you've got to be, you can almost see its little head popping up every now and again?
Yeah, ego is a tricky, it finds its way in wherever that little crack in the consciousness might be. And we're always needing to be vigilant with ourselves and our ego and check again, okay, am I falling back into old programming or old expectations or attachments, or is this really authentic for me right now? So absolutely, we're always needing to be vigilant with ourselves.
And then how does the inner child relate to this? Because if one of the aspects of the inner child is the need to be loved, right? And so needing to be loved can sometimes appear as wanting to please others. So when you're wanting to please others, that then links to ideas of expectation, you know, like, oh, realizing your potential is meeting the expectations of others because I'm wanting to please those people.
Yep, yep, we definitely have that. If we felt like we didn't get enough love and attention or affection or affirmation from like one of our parents, or, you know, someone we really looked up to, or maybe, you know, a teacher, but especially parents, we will always be trying to do things that would get us that attention, that affection, that what we might interpret as love. And
Mm.
um, and so then that develops into various personality traits that, you know, maybe we became the overachiever, or maybe we tried to become the funny one, always cracking jokes, or maybe we tried to become somebody who was always just prim and proper, and, you know, perfectionism, you know, all of those types of things come from the inner child not feeling quite loved. And maybe we were loved, it's just not necessarily showing up in the affectionate way that we were hoping it would,
It's
or thinking.
interesting, isn't it? And it can also, to me, this whole pleasing thing or proving something, it can sometimes come from trauma as well. Like I remember my probably teenager trauma was being bullied at high school for being the posh kid. I was the
Mm,
posh mank, you know, I could enunciate my words, and I got bullied for that. And for me, in my early 20s, what this manifested as was proving to the people that bullied to me that I was going to be successful. And so I was trying to prove something to the world. And it was only in my late 20s when I started this personal development journey that I realized, again, realizing potential was completely fake. I was trying to prove something, and it wasn't aligned from within. It was just me trying to basically give two fingers up to the world and say, well, screw you guys, look at me, look what I did, even though you bullied me. Does that make sense? It's interesting.
yeah. Yep. I can relate to, because for me it was, you know, like my parents were very loving and very supportive people, but my dad was always more of an introvert and intellectual kind of person, not so much the expressive feeler type. And I think as a child it was always about trying to gain that sense of the affirmation and the approval that, okay, you're doing good, and you're being approved of right now. And so for me it ultimately ended up in getting good grades, and, you know, going for advanced degrees and things like that. That was where I ended up getting a sense of that. But then down the line, I came to realize, like, okay, that was really just my projection of a measure of approval on to, you know, a father figure or something like that, and that it was really about me. I was ultimately trying to drive myself towards proving myself as good, right? And
Mm.
it comes from whether or not we feel good enough inside.
It does. It does. Okay, so we're starting off with this idea that there are expectations, there's kind of the Maya, the illusions of what we're trying to, you know, think we're proving to ourselves or others, etc. And when we start to strip all of that back, we then start to come into more of the Socratean realm of knowing thyself. And this is what I want to segue straight onto. So, what do you think about the idea that realizing one's potential is actually more fundamentally anchored to knowing thyself?
Mm-hmm. And there's so many ways in which that comes, right? So knowing thyself starts, for example, where I mentioned before, where we start asking ourselves the questions like, well, what do I like, and what is my rhythm, and what do I want to achieve, versus all the layers of expectation that you know, we kind of create this personality and we try to live into that. But when we start to really ask ourselves the right questions, we can get to know ourselves. But who we are is also often transforming and changing. So
Mhm.
what might have been what I wanted in the past isn't necessarily what I want now, because we learn from life and we grow from that process, and we realize, okay, well, I thought I wanted that, but now that I have it, I'm realizing that wasn't actually what I wanted.
Mhm.
And we get to so we're always in this process of coming to know ourselves. It's not like you ever get to this point where you 100% know yourself, because we're always transforming and changing. But then there's also you know, from the Hermetic teachings, it says, you know, as above, so below. So if we want to understand the universe, if we want to understand the divine, we need to understand ourselves, because we are the reflection of that, or we are the microcosm within the macrocosm.
Mm.
And from both a scientific perspective and a psychology perspective and a spiritual perspective, the more you really come to understand yourself, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, the more you do start to see the entire universe reflected within. And
Mm.
that's where we really start to tap into greater potential, because, we're only currently manifesting or realizing like 3% of our DNA potential is actively being used to create this body, for example. But the other 97%, like, what's it doing, right? And it is potential that we have yet to still become conscious of, to be tapping into and awakening those latent gifts that are within our DNA, for example. We're only using maybe the tip of the iceberg, in terms of conscious awareness of our brain capacity. We perceive 100% of information coming in through our five senses, but we're only consciously aware of maybe 10% of 1%. So it's like 0.1% of what's going on within our brain. But if we get hypnotized, for example, we then could have more and more and more recall, up to 100%. So what we're consciously aware of is just the tip of what we could become aware of. And so when we talk about expanding potential and really tapping into it, it's about becoming more aware, more conscious of the self and what's going on within, all the body functions, all the perceptions, multiple layers and frequencies of energy and dimensions and so forth, and then also utilizing more of that capacity within our DNA. So there's a lot there that we can come to know about ourselves.
Ooh, nice. Okay, so there's right. So I'm seeing the links with biology and the senses, fundamentally, and those senses are physical and spiritual and psychological and all of the above. Right, that's interesting. Okay, when I started personal development, one of the first seminars I went to was the Landmark Forum by Landmark Education, which is quite popular worldwide and all that stuff. Did that for a few years. It was great. And one of the key things that they talked about in the first things was knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. And then the idea of there's more than that. So I know what I know and can't know any more than what I know. I also know that I don't speak Arabic, right? So I know what I don't know. But there are things that you don't know,
Right.
and the things that you don't know, those are the blind spots. And that's where revelation and transformation happens from a personal development point of view. And because it is possible by working, see, it's not just, yet knowing thyself is working on thyself to know thyself, right? So if you work on yourself, you reveal the blind spots and you expand, you imagine like a little pie chart, you expand the slice of cheese that is how much you know about oneself. That's right. So you made some really lovely connections that I hadn't thought of with biology and senses down. On top of that, I wanted to throw in the place of mystical teachings, right? So if we think about, say, for example, Kabbalah, that helps us tap into lots of different types of energies, lots of universal forces, including archetypes. So if I think about archetypes, there's so many out there. And if I refer back to our old conversation, one of the things we sort of talked about is that there's a time and a place and a balance for the use of certain archetypes. Like it's not always the time to be, the specific archetype, whether it be, the warrior or the king or the queen or the justice or the mercy and all that stuff. There's a time and a place. So we can't ever be fully just one archetype, right? We've got to apply it in the right place. And for me, my instinct tells me that when there's a fly in the ointment, when there's this kind of distortion in our life, we need to pick out that distortion and perhaps shine the light of an archetype on that to remove that. So, I mean, how do we do that? How do we do that? How do I identify? First of all, do you agree with the idea that we need to be very selective about when we apply certain archetypes? And then, and if so, how do we identify what archetypes to increase this idea of potential?
Well, and that's, how do we identify it and how do we know which one to work with, is really, again, coming back to know thyself. Because if you don't know yourself, you can't identify it. So that's one of the reasons why I love Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, is that it shows us, certain key aspects of the pattern of who and what we are. And it's like you can use it as a mirror or a window into the self. And so as we study those different aspects of that universal pattern of the tree, And it has all the different archetypes on it, so there's at least the major archetypes are on it. Like there's 22 major arcana or major archetypes, and then there's also 10 or 11 spheres or key aspects of the divine. And when we use it, it's like you can study it and it becomes a lens or a mirror to know thyself, right? So you reflect upon yourself. Well, where do I embody those strengths and those weaknesses of that archetype? The light and the shadow of that archetype,
Mm,
for example. And what about this one? And so you get to know yourself in relationship to each part of that pattern of that tree and all those different archetypes and the way they show up. And then once you know, and you can start to identify and recognize, now we can say, oh, okay, well, I'm showing this current weakness. Like, let's say I've got a lot of anger coming up right now, and then we know, oh, well, that relates to this part of the tree of life pattern, that relates to this kind of warrior energy or this severity energy. And then what can I do to clean it up here? What can I do
mm,
to heal or rebalance out that aspect? And how maybe I need to bring in more of the mercy and the love component. Maybe I need to reinforce my boundaries because I'm letting those get stepped on. So you really
mm,
get to know this pattern, and it helps your mind to orient itself to be able to more clearly recognize the different aspects and archetypes that show up, and then we can understand its dynamic in the whole pattern. And I found that really helps to know. There's other mediums that we can use. So for example, my current season of mystery teachings is all about, season 4 is all about the tarot and the archetypes of the tarot. And so the tarot become another way in which we can get that window into the self, or that lens to reflect upon ourselves and to look at that. You could use numerology, you could use astrology. There's many different ways that you can kind of work with understanding what those archetypes are, their aspects, their characteristics, and then how they reflect back to you and help you learn about yourself, right? So there's many
mm,
different windows, but I think some systems, I think they all work. It's really just a matter of which system do you personally find a resonance with,
mhm.
and does it feel like, oh yeah, this really speaks to me and this resonates for me. So
Right. And as you were talking, then what came to me is that the importance of having a foundation of self-awareness. So when you do know your values and what you're about and your gifts and lots, all these different aspects of knowing oneself, um, it's when you know that you're deviating from your path, there's a sense of, sometimes it can feel like lots of things. It can feel like maybe lower self-esteem. It can feel that icky, almost like guilty, self-guilty, like I'm not doing what I'm meant to be doing. And you can just feel it, it's something that's quite palpable in your body. And I find that fascinating just even by itself. But the point is that we've got this guidance system within, that when we know in our hearts and our guts, our emotions, when we're off course. So as you were speaking then, what came to me was, use that feeling of knowing you're off course and bringing these things as guides, as energetic guides, to say, nope, come on. Like, for example, if you're being trampled over and you're not being courageous enough, maybe you need to activate a bit more warrior, or more king in the rule of one's domain, in the defense of one's boundaries, literally one's borders. There's a place for that.
mhm.
You have a domain over your life, and that's what the king energy is about, right? And so when you're getting trampled on and people are violating you, literally, you need to step up to that. So that's an example of that. You're out of misalignment, so activate it and step up into that.
Yeah.
And equally, sometimes we're being too aggressive, and that's when we need to bring in this other stuff to soften it, because we're stepping into other people's sovereignty.
Yeah. Well, and there's a couple keys within that. So, for example, society has often taught it's not okay to have strong boundaries, or it's not okay to bring out that warrior energy. So a
Mm,
lot of people, they often look at that energy as bad. And so the warrior energy in particular in our society has been given a bad label. It's all, everything
mm,
is violence and aggressiveness, and it's
mm,
getting labeled as a negative thing these days. But it is a really important archetype, and if we don't have relationship with it, as you're saying, we might not defend ourselves when we need to. So there is a time and a place where we need to harness that energy, but we also have to learn to control it versus it controlling us, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that when it comes to self-awareness, yeah, we have this internal barometer of when we're aligned and when we're out of alignment, but unfortunately a lot of people aren't ready to look at themselves, and when they start feeling out of alignment and like things are off, they turn to coping strategies to distract and to numb and to not listen to what's going on inside, whether it's drugs, alcohol, too much TV, sports, I mean, whatever it is, they kind of displace that lack of satisfaction and feeling aligned inside. And that's where so many people in our world just get really off track.
My old teacher and coach to me said to me, Chris, you can show people the mirror, but don't show it all at once, because if you show it all at once, they'll punch the mirror and run out the room, right? So you've got to do, as a coach, as a guide, as a teacher, you've got to show just a little bit and go, here you go. There's a glimpse, and even now, if there's people listening to this going like, oh my God, I admit I just go to my vices, I escape, but when I know that really I need to be activating some more of something to bring alignment in my life. Like just know, well, I'm speaking to these people now, just know that it's okay. Like we're all doing this, like, so I want to kind of reassure people that it's a journey of, do you know what? Actually taking action on this is a courageous thing. So like self-awareness is an act of courage in itself, because it's bringing integrity into your own kind of pillar of alignment, self-alignment, right? So knowing thyself and actually realizing one's potential is about activating all these different types of energies in your life at the appropriate point. That's one aspect that I'd like to put on the table, I think.
Mm-hmm. And we also, we're not on a journey to being perfect. A lot of people fall into perfection, that if I can't be perfect, then why bother? Or, they're too hard on themselves. And so then they're afraid to even go there sometimes. But it's about progress. It's not about perfection. So we're on a journey.
What even is that? What even is that? So sorry to interrupt, like what even is perfection, right? Because what I mean by that is people might get the misconception of, sorry, I got excited then, Theresa, I apologize.
That's like,
like think about, like, for example, the different archetypes and different energies. People might have the idea in their head that perfection is always being this or always being that. And again, that comes down to self-expectation or expectations on you, etc. And we can more fundamentally realize again that according to the circumstance and the thing that needs to be developed at that point in time, it's our journey. There's always a different thing at a different point. We activate a different version of perfection, which maybe is that archetypal energy, right?
Yeah. And, a lot of those ideas that we have in our head are defined by, again, culture, family, religion, society. They're defined by outer things. And, and it's very individualized based on what our circumstances were growing up and what we were exposed to growing up. And that's what we create our ideals of perfection, and mother and father and what's masculine, what's feminine. We tend to look to or model after our parents, whether they were there, weren't there, how they showed up. And, that really distorts the archetypes in our minds. So it's about progress versus being a certain way. And progress is instead of comparing ourselves to other people and measuring ourselves against that outer measuring stick, it's about looking at how was I yesterday and how can I improve today. Right. So it's this, like the Japanese have a great concept called Kaizen, which is everyday little improvements, and every day becoming better and better. So we're only comparing ourselves to how we were in the past. And we're just, looking for those markers of progress. And that journey is, you mentioned before, it's about working on ourselves. Coming to know ourselves is about working on ourselves. And in the ancient Hermetic and alchemical tradition, we called that the great work, is that journey towards continuing to improve ourselves to really achieve that full divine potential within.
And whilst there's so much behind that, that also might be a great way of putting it simply. Realizing one's potential is the great work, because then the great work is fundamentally anchored from within. But then we anchor from within in relation to these more universal energies and forces around us, and mechanisms and tools of realization. Yeah, right. No, I totally get it. There's a good segue here, I think, to masculinity and femininity, because that's also something I want to talk about today. And on your recent season on Gaia, you talked about the infinity loop, and how there's an idea that, or maybe a truth indeed, that the infinity loop, when you think about it, most people see like an 8 and it's even, right? But you discussed this idea that actually it's uneven. I won't put words in your mouth. Could you unpack that a little for the audience?
Yeah. So the infinity loop, often people think 50-50, right? That you have half on one loop and half on the other loop. But when you have 50-50, so let's say one half is a masculine pole, meaning when I say masculine, I mean the energy is outward moving. It's the initiating energy. It's set, like if we think just from physics perspective, it would be a positive charge that like a proton, for example, where the energy moves out, the electric fields actually move out from that positive charge. And then the other side would have the negative, or the feminine, which is taking it in, it's receiving it. And so when you have the two charges, the energy can move between them. But if you look at the case of a proton and an electron, which form an atom, just as an example, you have equal charges, so equal power, but they're very different things. They have very different mass. They have very different way of behaving. They have very different interactions. And yet together they create the atom that creates, builds up all the things in the universe. So if we take that as a, feminine, masculine now, it's not about 50-50. Yes, it's equal power. But if you have, if you think of the scales, and you have the lever in between and you have the scales, when you have 50-50, equal weight, equal everything, what happens?
It's perfect balance and there's no movement.
Exactly. It's a perfect balance. No movement means stagnation.
Yes.
So it's kind of like there's nothing happening when they're in perfect sameness as each other. But when you create a little bit of an imbalance, now you can think of also, those old wave machines, like from the 80s, I think it was, and they had like the two different liquids in it, and it would kind of go back and forth, back and forth. And so that's because there was different amounts of liquid and different viscosity, different densities of the two different liquids, and it would move back and forth like a wave machine. And so that now you have this dynamic flow happening between the two different sides. And the only way to get that is if you have different proportions versus same. So instead of 50-50, there's different ways that we can look at it, like the yin and the yang and the yin. It's about a 70-30 split is the ideal. We're not going to say that everyone's like that. There's kind of a bell curve, but the majority of the people are going to be if they're in perfect balance between feminine and masculine within them, it's about a 70-30 split. And we're talking again about energy. We're not talking about physical gender or anything like that, or even sexual orientation. It's about your it's about your energy and how you use your energy. So it's more maybe the soul energy. And so when you have, like 70-30, or we could even say 60-40, we can talk about that from the sense of music. It's the perfect fifth, right? So if you take the notes on the musical scale and, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and then you line them up, the point of harmony is at the note of so. It's the perfect fifth off of the scale of the octave. And so that would say you have do, re, mi, fa on one side, so right in the center point where the crossover is, and then la, ti on the other side. So it's this perfect fifth is where the harmony happens. And that is what then, and we can tie that into things like the golden mean, which also relates to the 5/8, which relates to the Fibonacci sequence. That's kind of getting mathematical about it. But when you have, for example, the golden ratio, the golden mean, it is now creating a proportion where it is life enhancing, it is ever expanding. If you think of like the golden spiral, it kind of starts, but then it expands and it expands fast versus just a circular spiral. It's very different. So we have, this sort of ever expanding dynamic that comes, and that golden ratio shows up so many places in in the universe, in music, in the arrangement of the stars, and the arrangement of how like a pine cone grows, or a tree grows, or a shell grows, you know, that even within our own body, we are golden mean proportion all over.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of golden ratio is really more the perfect balance that creates harmony, but also instead of stagnation, it's this ever expanding dynamic flow of energy that happens.
Got it. Fascinating. It really is. And I've got a musical background. I come from a musical family, so I get this stuff. Like I grew up learning the piano, and I play the guitar and all that stuff. So I don't know how accurate this quote is, but I found this on the old interweb today, and it was apparently a Lao Tzu thing. And let me read it off. Lao Tzu apparently said, the perfect fifth is the sound of universal harmony between the forces of yin and yang, and the transition point where matter crosses over into spirit. I don't know whether that's an accurate quote, but it feels lovely. And when I think more musically, if I think about like playing a guitar or whatever, when I strike a perfect fifth, there is something very calming about it. It doesn't matter where it is on the keyboard. It's you know, it's actually, that is in a lot of things like I think gamelan music as well, and it appears in like everywhere. It's not just Western music. So the perfect fifth is very interesting to me. And you mentioned the idea of the 70-30 split, and I'd like to kind of take this apart a little bit musically as well. But in terms of masculinity and femininity, my point of view on it is that it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. I feel one individual tends to be predominantly masculine or predominantly feminine, right? But we have both in us. And so I think where we've got lost in terms of the social conversation is, I'll tell you one area that we've got lost. It's kind of the demonization of one or the other. That just doesn't work, right? You know, so if we demonize the being feminine, that's awful. And also equally, unfortunately, I think masculinity has been demonized, and you know, there's a lot of phrases that have been brought in where it's basically saying it's like bad to be masculine, and you know, people try to make that argument and create all these like this tension around it. But I don't know, like what I realize is that if I think about even just my marriage with my wife, I know that I'm masculine predominantly, and I know that she's definitely predominantly feminine, but together we create something that's greater than what we could do individually. And that's interesting to me from the place of relationship. But in terms of the split, yes, I find that attractive, the idea of, you know, I would definitely think that I'm predominantly masculine, and that 70% feel about right. And, you know, but I also know there's a place in my life to be receiving and literally to birth things from a creative aspect, and to be that space, you know, the feminine, you know, space. Femininity to me also means to be like a space where you welcome in and all that kind of stuff. And I've definitely discovered that more as a father of two young kids, because, you know, as a younger man, I was maybe guilty of being more just yang and more just, just only that. But as a father now, you know, I realize that my children need that as well. They need the strength of the masculine, but they also need daddy to be soft in certain times, right? So that's fascinating to me. I'm rabbiting on. Here's the link to music. Check this out, right? You got C going all the way up to C, right? And if you look at the tones of if you look at the white keys on a keyboard, there are 7 notes before it then repeats itself, right? And 7, from a numerological point of view, is a very important number. But what's interesting to me is that, as well as this idea as the perfect fifth, if you divide 5 by 7, it equals 71.4%. So I just find that interesting. Like, if we are predominantly whatever, masculine, do we exist in this like first fifth area, and the other little bit is our other bit, you know? And how does that relate to relationships? Is there a link? And that center point on the infinity loop, is that the perfect place where we reach union with our spirit and our partner, and they're the other bit? And I almost, in my mind, I've got this image of one infinity loop that's predominantly this way over here, and another one that's over here, and they kind of overlap, and I don't know, they create something in this kind of center point. And this is just an image I've got in my mind. I've not fully connected it. I wanted to talk to you about it because you're a genius. And what do you think? Like, you know, what do you think about this idea of, like, do the maths of 5 by 7 and the center point, the fifth, is that where we meet in relationship? I don't know.
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions in there. If I can keep track of it all. So yeah, it's, you know, ideal, let's just say it was that perfect fifth, or that's about 70% one and 30% the other. And that's not, again, that's not going to like be for everybody. It's a bell curve, right?
Sure.
So it's a bell curve for men and there's a bell curve for women in terms of where your percentages are energetically, regardless of your physical gender. But what's important is, yes, recognizing we all have both masculine and feminine within us. And we need both, because if you don't have both masculine and feminine, you don't have creation, right? So we need the outward thrusting energy and we need the inward receiving energy. And only with the two can we have creative work happening. Can we manifest things? Can we birth things into the world? And, so it takes the both to, two to tango, right? So it takes both energies. Now, if you have two people come together and they're both in their feminine energy, doesn't matter what their gender is, if they're both in feminine energy, they're both kind of going to sit there waiting to receive from the other. They're going to wait for the other person to initiate something, but they're both sitting in feminine energy. So then nothing really happens from that, right? So that's not going to be a very creative dynamic between them. They're going to just kind of be sitting there together. Maybe they'll enjoy their sitting in silence together, but it's not going to be a highly creative energy. If you have two people, on the other hand, come together and they're both in their masculine energy and they're both trying to basically initiate and direct what is happening, they're going to wind up getting into a little bit of this power struggle, or maybe a little bit of a missing match. And again, this is not about your physical gender. This is about your energy and how you use your energy. So when you have two people coming forward trying to kind of control or direct the situation, that's when they butt heads. And you have a lot of women these days, dominate, like kind of being more in their masculine energy than in their feminine. You have a lot of men these days who are, also kind of sitting in their feminine energy more than their masculine energy. So we have a lot of kind of blurring of what's masculine and what's feminine these days. But when you have two people come together, again, regardless of gender, it's not about intimacy or anything like that even, it's about creative work. And it can be your romance, it can be a business partner or a co-creator, something like that. You have to come together and have different energies that you're bringing to the plate so that you can find that way to harmonize together. Now, the ideal would be if you have someone, for example, who's 70% masculine and 30% feminine. Their ideal complement would be somebody who's 70% feminine and 30% masculine. And then you have them coming together with those two, different infinity loops, and they combine, and then you wind up having 100% masculine and 100% feminine through the combination of the two. And that's when real magic can happen, when it's complementary. So when it comes to finding that ideal match, whether it's a creative partner or a romantic partner or whatever, is to find your complementary other, whatever that may be for you as an individual, right? So this is again where you have to know thyself and then figure out what is your flow and your best way of operating, and then kind of draw to you the person who is that good complement to your energy that's not going to be the same as you. It's not, you don't want to date yourself, for example, or create with yourself. You want to find someone who brings different components to the plate, and you two together can create a really good synergy. And when you can do that, then definitely what you create together becomes greater than what either one of you could create alone. And that's what we really need to find.
I agree. And I think if it could maybe be so bold, I think like we think about, say, the 70s conversation on feminism, and then feminism has evolved a lot, right? I think when it comes, and this is not me like having a go at feminism, it's equally the other way around, okay? But let me just say it. Like, I think what's happened is that feminism, quite rightly, was about the empowerment of women, right? And over the last, 50 years or so now, it's been a long time, many decades. Sometimes what can happen in cultural conversation is, when you talk even like this, like we are now, some people can feel defensive. And it's often like defensive conversation to say, oh, are you saying you can't be like this, if you're a woman, or you can't be like this if you're a man? Like it, and it's just kind of like, it's missing the point. The point is that we have both inside of us, and we do tend to have a predominance, and it's good to embrace the predominance. And literally, no one is saying that, for example, let's imagine if you're a woman that is 70% feminine and 30% masculine. No one, this conversation is not saying you can't express masculine energy in your life. It's just saying that you might have a predominance. So that's the point that I want to get. I think we've gotten lost in popular cultural conversation to say, you're just talking about this. It's like, oh, but a woman can be this, and well, of course it can, because we live in a free society now, and people are empowered, and all power to everyone. I really do feel that and know that. But yeah, we just need to like embrace both sides. That's my point.
We absolutely, we have lost the plot in today's, whatever, this kind of conversation may not be politically correct, so to speak.
I don't care. I'd rather have a real one, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we have lost the plot in the whole, whole gender conversation of today, the whole empowerment, of women, and, all of it, all of it's been kind of misdirected. And like you said, we've gotten to this place where masculinity has started to become demonized and labeled as bad, whereas in the past, it was a certain other kind of, maybe femininity was diminished, and so masculine and feminine, we need to come back to a place where we honor both archetypes, because they are divinely generated archetypes that are needed, and we need to have a good relationship. Just much, people like to throw around this toxic masculinity term a lot today.
That kind of stuff. Like, I don't like it as a man. Like, I'm a loving father. I support my wife and everything, and it hurts me as a man. That hurts my feelings, because I'm a realized individual that wants every single person in the world to be realized and to realize the potential and be empowered. And to me, yes, you'll have a predominance, and so it's about enabling freedom from within and empowerment. That's it, and then recognizing that we've got these things going on. That to me, it's not about one or the other, and whether one's bad or good.
It's not about masculinity being toxic or femininity being toxic, because we have just as much toxicity, with women as well. It's just in a different way. But it's about people. Individuals
Correct. It's about people. Exactly right. And we have a predominance.
Femininity. And so we need to get rid of labeling masculine or feminine as good or bad. And we need to realize that people are people, and they're individuals who express in negative ways. And whether they're male or female doesn't, that's kind of besides the issue. It's them and their soul. What's going on with them. They need healing and so forth. And so that's where the conversation needs to be. So let's change that. Number one, like for me as a woman, I can definitely relate to the women's empowerment and the kind of feminism, because I grew up with a mother that was very much about, be independent, be strong, don't rely on, a man to support you, all of these types of things. You can achieve anything. There shouldn't be a glass ceiling for you, this kind of stuff. And yet I, and I went into physics. So I went into a very male dominated kind of career path. And I had to learn to adapt into a male way of operating to survive graduate school, for example.
Right.
Weeding out the weak ones, and you have to sacrifice a lot. But it was very difficult as a woman. And so yet in my own journey to succeed in what I considered a man's world, I really had to almost denature myself from my more feminine side and become more dominant in my masculine. And then I found myself so out of balance from that experience. Like, yes, I could do it all. Yes, I could be independent. Yes, I could be really equally strong, equally smart, all of that kind of stuff, equally successful. But what I found was that trying to be that way, as somebody who more naturally actually had more feminine energy, I found that it was depleting. So what we need to recognize is, when it comes to knowing ourselves, what is my proper balance of masculine and feminine? You have to ask yourself, well, what activities fulfill me and refuel me versus deplete me? Right. And so for me as a woman, I found actually, yes, I could do all of this and be in the masculine energy. And I was driven in that way, but it was depleting. Whereas when I started to learn to shift, and that really took a lot of peeling the layers of the conditioning and the programming and my own sort of assumptions and all of those attachments and things, as I peeled those away, I started to shift and align more based on Kabbalistic principles and principles of creation, like what is feminine and what is renewing and refueling to me, was fulfilling to me. And as I started to shift more back into more of a feminine flow, it was very different from how the world teaches us, but I found that it was much more fulfilling, much more
Mm-hmm.
magical, much more
Mm-hmm.
powerful. And yet I felt like I was more in my own skin versus always having to prove myself. Right. So this is something that I think a lot of women in today's world could really benefit from, is recognizing and starting to reclaim the power of being in their feminine, not just in their masculine. Right. The feminine doesn't need to prove itself
You
through
took the words out of my mouth, and you said that literally on one of you guys' series, and it struck me like a chord. And I thought it was so powerful. Like I work with a lot of fellow female colleagues in the business that I work in, and their presence is so powerful. They don't have to, should we say, they have to push anything with that masculine initiating energy, etc. It's just their presence. And it's
right.
effortless, you know, but it's so relevant to the conversation that we're having in that context of a meeting or whatever it is, or a commercial decision, and that's so important.
And I think a lot of women don't realize their own inner worth. You know, they have this lack of self, you know, there's this insecurity that goes on, there's a lack of self-love, and so then because of that, they're constantly working to externally prove themselves in a
Right,
similar kind of way that the masculine would try to demonstrate its power.
right,
And so and yet they're not going to receive the kind of love and acknowledgement they want from that kind of external demonstration. They need to find that internal love and
mm-hmm.
acceptance, and then just be it. And then they're going to find that they receive all the compliments and acknowledgement and so forth that they're seeking. It's been a really fascinating shift, and it's kind of hard to describe, but I think there will be those out there who resonate with this.
Totally, you're describing it beautifully, and equally, there's two things come up that I want to, you know, again bring into the conversation. I acknowledge that it must have been very difficult going into the world of physics, etc. as a woman. I do acknowledge that. I would also like to say that I'm sure there would be professions that if I went to as a masculine male, I'd probably walk through the door and go, oh my God, I can't do this. You know, like I just want to acknowledge that I think it does exist. Again, there's two sides to the street here, you know, and so I'm not saying anything counter to what you're saying. I'm just saying equally that there is also that. The other thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that, you know, a positive expression of, for example, feminism is not having dependence on someone else and being an independent person. And, you know, and equally, it doesn't matter whether, you know, your sexuality or anything. It doesn't matter whichever way it goes. But like fundamentally, if you're in a dependent relationship, emotionally, spiritually, energetically, economically, etc., you know, if you've not got two, shall we say, I know it's cheesy, but like two holes coming to the equation, then dependency exists, right? So I reference that to be quite specific, that one of the absolutely wonderful things of feminism is that it is saying, you know, don't be dependent anymore, because, you know, we're not in the 1950s. You know, you're not the 1950s housewife with a vacuum cleaner and 5 kids in your arms saying, hello, husband, I've made you dinner. Like, you know, we're so beyond that, you know, we're so beyond that. And to me, it's that thing of independence. Here's my distinction. Being an independent woman is, to me, about not necessarily having to prove that you're masculine in a predominant way. It's about being independent and not being, you know, do you know what I mean? Like not being dependent on the person. Do you see what I mean? It's a simple point, but it's an important one because it can manifest as trying to be something else that maybe is not authentic and it's depleting.
Yeah. So to me, independence means you can stand on your own 2 feet, create within your own world without needing somebody else to bring you a sense of balance, right? So you know that you're good on your own. You're happy with your life. You don't need somebody else to make you happy or to help you survive or anything like that, that you can create whatever you need to create from within your own self. But women also need to be careful in today's world because there has been such an emphasis on independence. And I can completely relate to this because it was like I was at all costs trying to be independent.
Okay, this is where it's interesting.
Yeah, to the point that, you know, it's like there was almost a fear of allowing myself to rely upon somebody else. You know, there was almost this, it went, you know, you can go too far with that independence and you become walled off from other people.
Right.
you don't want a man to open the door for you because, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that I
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
open
yeah.
my own door? Or you don't want them to, treat you in a certain way because, it's just, you start thinking like, well, what are you implying, that I'm weak, or that so
Mm,
it can go too far because
mm.
the programming has its double edge, right?
It does.
So
It
it's
does.
got
Yeah.
its light, it's got its shadow. So I think independence is really good as a starting foundation, and
Mm-hmm.
that's about coming to wholeness and within yourself,
Mm,
fulfillment within yourself, happiness within yourself. And then we move beyond independence, then come not dependence, not codependence,
mm-hmm.
not too far with independence, but coming into what we can call interdependence, which is
Mm-hmm.
people who are independent and have their own strong foundation underneath them,
Mm-hmm.
but then they come together with that synergy and create something that's even more beautiful, more magical, more rewarding and enriching
Mm.
than what we would be alone, right? And that's what we
Exactly.
move to, so we can come to this era of, it's not about masculine dominance or feminine dominance, it's
Yep.
about divine union, it's about
Yes.
balance and equally honoring even though we're different.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. The really good, great conversation. So beautifully put. And to me, it's two established artists coming together to see what they can create on the canvas in front of them. And we can
Mm,
do something that is new when we come together. And that's what relationship is. And to
mm,
me, there are so many things that my wife teaches me in terms of, the times where I need to access my femininity because, she teaches me that because it's not who I am predominantly. And then, and it's not just about that, but more broadly, that's what relationships are. Like we admire other people because we um, we find their qualities aspirational, perhaps something that we realize from within that we need to become a little bit more of, at least in certain situations.
yeah, yeah, it's good.
Right. No, very good. Very good. So basically, we just need to be less, it's not about a conversation of defensiveness or one being good or bad. It's about saying that there's a predominance and we can, the way, okay, so the original conversation is realizing potential, right? So how
That's
do you realize
right.
potential? You find maybe it's accessing what nurtures you and finding out what that balance is.
Yeah, that comes back to knowing thyself again, right? And
Yeah.
knowing yourself, being comfortable within yourself, and
Yeah.
then knowing what works for you and what doesn't, and then just being clear about that, right? It's not about another person being good or bad, wrong or right. It's just what works for you. And then, yeah, and then sometimes when you really find that nice compliment, it's about learning to also adapt and adjust to become us versus me and you, so it's
Mm-hmm.
learning that synergy of union versus being separated and
Mm.
just within one's own self. So there's, yeah, a whole dynamic. I mean, relationships are one of our greatest teachers in our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and it's important to find that synergy in relationships because we're very social creatures.
Mm. And then, and indeed, coming back to the infinity loop thing, if it was balanced, nothing would happen, right? And you know, um, sometimes there's a transcendent creation by coming together, and sometimes there's also a, you know what, you're right. We need to be this way in this situation. It's a deferring, a humility.
Yeah. And I want to kind of correct a word here, balance, right?
Okay,
We seek that balance, and I think the balance is important, but what we need to shift in our concepts is thinking that balance means the same.
correct.
50-50, equal, right? We're not equal, we're not the same. We're different, and that's okay. The balance is going to come instead of a static balance, which is the 50-50. It's going to be a dynamic balance. It's, imagine the balance of like you're walking the tightrope and you're
Mm-hmm.
constantly having to adjust between the left and the right sides with that balancing pole. It's very dynamic. It's never a static kind of process. And so that's the balance we're seeking but that comes from a 70-30 or a golden mean ratio or something besides the 50-50, right? So true balance is a very dynamic balance.
Mm-hmm.
It's constantly in flux. It's constantly, there's a rhythm to it. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between masculine and feminine versus same and stagnation.
And that makes me think of yin and yang and the whole black-white symbol. And I think it was Wayne Dyer who said something like, it's about not being one or the other, but walking the line in between, hence the dynamic continual adjustment, and never
Yeah.
having a
When
particular
the yin
destination.
yang, in the yin you have a little bit of the yang, and in the yang you have a little bit of the yin, and they're
Yes.
constantly moving and rotating and actually morphing one into the other, and it's this constant dance that happens between the two. So it's
Mm.
not a static symbol.
Mm. Wow. Okay. Well, look, Theresa, I can't believe it's been an hour already. I love it. I want to be, I'm sure you've got things to crack on with in the day. I believe that you're now in the UK. Can you tell us about that?
I am in the UK. I'm looking at a move in this direction. So I'm in northern England right now. It's
Yeah.
it's a little bit cold, a little bit rainy compared to Southern California, but it's really charming and beautiful. And
Mhm.
yeah, starting a new life with a partner out here. So
Oh, congratulations on the move. Yes, I believe that you're just a few miles down the road from where I grew up in Manchester. So that tickles me and warms my heart. It really does. Well, look, Theresa, it's been a pleasure as always. For people to connect with you, I'm sure I can only highly recommend personally that they go to Gaia and watch all the series on the mystery teachings. That's just a wonderful resource of deep, deep knowledge. But if people want to connect with you, where are the best places for them to go?
yeah, the best place is to my website, theresabullard.com. And then everything, like all of my Gaia series stuff, they can find access to it, the links and stuff from my personal website. If they want to be, receiving my newsletter, which has articles and other event announcements, they can sign up for the newsletter there. There's lots of videos and so forth that explains a lot of the other work that I do. So
Fantastic.
theresabullard.com.
TheresaBullard.com. We shall put all of that in the show notes below. Thank you so much for coming on again, and wishing you all the best with the move. And I look forward to conversing soon again.
Thank you, Chris. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.